Hello, everybody, and welcome to Trans Heartbeat. My name is Michelle Matlock, and I encourage the use of all pronouns. Today, I get to sit down with someone who speaks my language, a storyteller, a performer, organizer, teacher, clown, actor, and all-around creative human being. My guest is Eisa Al-Shamma, a trans artist whose work explores identity, joy, vulnerability, and what it means to tell the truth through performance. So settle in and join me for a thoughtful, funny, and inspiring conversation with Eisa Al-Shamma. This is Trans Heartbeat. Eisa, welcome to Trans Heartbeat. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
If you could share with us your full name, pronouns, if you like, where you are coming from in the world and what you're up to.
My name is Eisa Al-Shamma, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm in my house or in my apartment in Oakland, California. And what I'm up to, I'm taking my lunch break today. I'm a staff organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So I was taking my break out of usual organizing activities to take this call.
So I am so intrigued by you and reading up on you and finding out. I think we're a little bit of kindred spirit in the performing arts world. So I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to just start sort of at the beginning. And I'm hoping you can take us into a little bit about your journey as a trans artist and performer. Like specifically, what drew you specifically to improv, acting, clowning, and physical theater?
Yeah, I think I've always been a bit of a clown. I think the thing that characterizes my trans journey is having had some deep feelings of affirmation at a young age, and love and support from my family, and being able to carry that self-affirmation through transition and then broadcast my transition through performing arts. So I think, what draws me to the theater is how fun it is to put on fake mustaches and man's clothing and to play crazy characters and be on a stage and sort of like make people laugh. Those are things that I just really, really enjoy and I've always enjoyed from a young age. And if I think back to like the home videos I was making as a kid, it was always an excuse to just like play pretend as a guy. And I'm just so grateful that that was never like punished in a very literal way. Because it was enough to like go through the sort of anguish of coming to terms with my own transition over the years of my childhood and young adulthood. That was like already very challenging in and of itself.
How did that form, whether it be improv, acting, clowning, maybe meet you or even free you in your gender expression? I mean, you explained it just a little bit now, but can you have more to say about that, the freedom in any of the art forms?
Yeah, I remember, a story I used to tell with my mom. My mom and I are very close, and one thing we talk about is like when I was in middle school, I got cast in the school play in my acting class as a guy, and I had to wear a suit. And my mom describes, I don't have any memory of this, but my mom describes me being like, I have to wear a suit. like so, excited about it. And I love that thing. Like it was the first time I ever got to wear a suit in my life when I was like probably 11 years old. And
wonderful.
So there's all these opportunities in performing arts to try on new embodied experiences and to see what you like, basically. I think costume, character, and there's something also about improv where you enter a scene and you become very familiar with like who your baseline is, because you start to notice patterns in your own scenes. Like, why am I always coming on as like the old man with the broom? Like, maybe I want to be an old man, why is my character always like a guy? There's certain things like that where you start to kind of like, oh yeah, I guess it's because like I see myself as a guy,
Right.
So there's ways in which that art form sort of reflects back on who you are. Clowning also is very much, I think, about sort of stripping yourself bare of other sort of, you have to really like release sort of like, what's what I'm looking for, release any inhibitions and release your own sort of like self-doubts or judgments and really open up who you are. I think the quality of clowning and this is a not very well informed opinion on clowning. I haven't studied that much clown, but I think like the quality of clowning, I think depends on your ability to really understand who you are and expose that in a way that is safe for yourself, and so that the audience can, enjoy and kind of pick it apart in a way. Like you're almost like making fun of yourself through all of your idiosyncrasies. And so to be able to make fun of yourself, you have to know who you are.
That is so true. I mean, I've been in clowning for many, many years now, and it's very much showing up who you are, essentially who you are, and being able to acknowledge that and sit in that presence. And that leads me into the next question, actually. So in clown, what I've discovered over so many years and is that failure is the doorway into clowning. It's we see it as a gift, right? Like being able to acknowledge that failure. It goes so against what what we're taught, I guess, socially. Like we don't want to be failed. We're wrapped in this sort of perfection in this country, in this world. So in clown, failure is the doorway and it is the gift. And I think for many of us in trans and gender expansive communities, we've been told we're too much or not enough in different ways. So, how have you navigated failure, risk, and vulnerability in your work? And how has that shaped your sense of freedom, both on stage and off?
Such a good question. It's interesting because I feel like my performance work is often characterized by the audience seeing it and thinking, wow, you really like went to a deep and vulnerable place. And for me, it's very cathartic and almost easy to go there on stage, and just like put it all out there, because it's like there's like a thrill to do it. There's sort of like a thrill about it. Yeah, it's very, very fun. And there are other challenges that I definitely experience, that I don't necessarily clown about, or I haven't clowned about. And I think the reality is you kind of have to digest some of the failure that you're about to display before you display it.
Right.
And then sometimes the skill is like digesting it, but then tapping back into it. Like if you're too processed about something, I solved all my problems, like you have no passion. You have to like allow yourself to like get back into the headspace of when the challenge was. And like that's, I think, the mark of a good performer is if you like can have the same kind of intense performance night after night, of a totally contained experience, but like tap back into it and explore that world like of that character. So in some ways, how has that shaped my sense of freedom? To navigate this vulnerability and whatnot. It's one great tool for navigating vulnerability, I think, and it makes me feel very free. It's very freeing to be on stage and to say what's on your mind, and that's definitely a gift, that the audience gives you, I think, because they're there to watch you speak your mind. That's my awkward roundabout way of answering that
No, I
question.
love it. No, it's good. I love it. I love it. Just hearing you talk about it, it's great. So I found this excerpt of your writing in Empathetic Storytelling, Volume 2. And in this excerpt, you name so clearly the lies that were taught to you about gender, desirability, race, and belonging, and how those messages lived inside you. So I'm curious, is writing a process of unlearning, of reclaiming or witnessing your younger self, or something else? How does writing unfold for you?
Yeah, I wrote a book actually about freezing my eggs as a trans person,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I'll have to get you a copy of it, because it definitely, I think, was a new dive into an art form, and I got to explore writing and talked about clowning in the book a little bit too, because it was happening like at the same time. I was freezing my eggs at the same time as I was performing as a clown.
Oh, wow.
And so I had this like really bizarre hormonal experience, body experience happening while I was, going on stage and dressing as a man. And Yeah, I think that writing is absolutely a part of this creative process. I think like for me, the writing that I've done that's felt like the most powerful writing, and the writing that I've published and really wanted people to read, and is writing to perform in the same way you might think of like putting on a show to
Yeah,
perform.
sure.
That kind of writing goes through many iterations, and the iterations of it are it's storytelling. These types of writing are memoir. They're like storytelling, basically. And the iteration is to like really inspect the memory that I'm telling with a very close, fine tooth comb, and like think about it. Is that really what happened? Like, is that really how I felt?
Mm,
Like, is that really what happened?
right.
And you can dig and dig to get to the core of the memory and also to the core of what you're trying to say. Because I think that the experiences that we have tell us all we need to know in a way. If you just like pick it apart and kind of see what's really
Sure.
there. So writing is absolutely a process of witnessing myself. And I think it's a process also of putting into context the stories that we experience. It puts stories in a frame. I think overall, of all the art forms that I engage with, I think what I like to call myself, because I did improv and clown, then I did writing, do all this kind of stuff. I think storytelling is like the way that I think of myself as a storyteller. And so all stories need a frame. And like in writing, your frame is whatever you find the frame in writing, and you're in the piece that you're writing. Like, how am I going to sort of like contextualize this story to give it a particular meaning? Same thing in improv. Like, what is this format that we're using? How are we going to frame the stories that we're going to tell? And in
Right.
clowning, of course.
Right.
So yeah, I think writing is about placing my story in a frame that fits into whatever is going on in the world.
Beautiful. That is awesome. So, there's something deeply radical about joy, and us living in our joy, especially right now. Can you talk a little bit about how joy, play, humor, absurdity function in your work? I mean, do you see performing as a form of resistance right now? Is performing playing out? Because I know, like, for me, it is the number one only way right now. My creativity and what I do is my form of resistance. It's like what I can contribute. And I'm wondering if you find it that way too, or if healing or even survival or any of those things.
Absolutely, yeah. What's coming to mind is the like expression like, um, I'd rather live on my feet than die on my knees. Sorry, die on my feet than live on my knees.
There you
I'd
go.
rather die on my feet than live on my knees. We hit it. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. And I think playing and experiencing joy and taking the time to make art, to make joyful art, and to sort of like, you know, just do anything fun or worthwhile is about dying on your feet and not living on your knees. And I see my creative practice as a way to re-energize myself and remind myself of my own humanity. Um, in the organizing work that I do, things feel very serious and heavy all the time. Um, and they are heavy and serious um, because we're dealing with the fate of the world, you know.
Right, right.
Um, but you're probably not going to succeed in winning um, if you just have if you're not being a human when you do it. Like if you're not like I think our ability to be joyful and make art is what makes us human, and is our humanness that will allow us to win. Yeah, I think some of the most profound moments of like theater and and culture uh, and like performance have happened um, in different contexts, in contexts where the struggle was at its most pitched state.
Right.
So like some of the best theater I've ever seen was my students in special education that I used to teach. Just like there was some like stuff that they did in front of their class or like in front of the school, little moments of like what I would consider theater that were just like so raw and awesome and hilarious and powerful, emotional. And it would be impossible to frame it for anybody else except for in my own like view of witnessing, like a
Right.
child, be themselves in front of other people. And some of the other most powerful experiences of theater I've ever had were marching in the streets at anti-war demonstrations.
Right.
Or like recently, these students at several high schools in Fruitvale all walked out on January 30th as part of the nationwide shutdown action that happened. And like hundreds of students, this was an event that I helped organize. Hundreds of students like left school in the middle of the day on a Friday and walked to Fruitvale Plaza.
Right.
And they got up on the mic and one after the other, in front of this whole crowd of students said, we stand for like, fuck ICE. Like we stand together. We stand united. Like I stand with my brothers and sisters. Like there was just really like, that was like one of the most amazing, like you could call it like an experience of theater.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
people were on a stage with a microphone in their hand. Right.
Yeah.
And so what else would we call that? And we had gathered, we'd called a call time. We
Right.
had a program, and afterwards we marched and people brought art. They brought their own signs that had their own slogans on them. Right. And so I think that was like one of the most amazing days I've ever experienced in my life. And, so absolutely like the joy in resistance. And of course there were funny moments too, like moments when people were cracking up because, I remember one moment when I'm standing next to another organizer who she and I have known each other for many months. And we've been at these very serious, anti-war demonstrations. And, at the anti-war demonstrations, we always get on the mic. We're like, the people condemn it's like this very sort of like intense language. And we're talking about these grand, like crazy things that are happening.
Right.
And this kid gets up on the mic and says like, I just want to say like, fuck ICE and Trump's a bitch. And me and this other organizer just start cracking up. We look at each other like, that's the truth. Like,
That's it. The truth.
Like, and it gives me chills thinking about it,
Yeah. I mean, I think the most important part of that is the truth. I mean, like, and that's a part, I think that's what comes out in clowning too. When we get to the truth and just in real time, it's the funniest, funniest moments. It's when it's just like the simplicity of being real and like telling the truth. So I love that. It's so powerful and so true.
Exactly.
And I think that I agree with you. I think that some of the most powerful theater and comedy comes out of, crisis, oppression, or, just like, when things are hard. So yeah, very powerful. So for audiences who may not yet understand improv or clown, or who may not yet understand the trans experience, what do you hope they feel or walk away with after encountering your work? And what does it look like in your vision for more trans voices to take up space in these art forms?
I hope they feel super guilty. I think I want people to feel like they can be themselves. And I want people to feel maybe a little bit more brave.
Mm.
And I think, when I wrote Squeezing My Eggies, I had this book talk where I invited just all my friends and community to come and talk about the book, basically. And I told a bunch of stories and I read a passage from the book, and then we had a whole conversation with all the audience members. And it was interesting to me that like some of the closest collaborators on that project were not trans people, but cis people who had also frozen their eggs. And the overall feeling and sentiment of that particular project, which I would say is the most recent sort of big endeavor that I've taken up, most recent sort of big performance. I would say the overall theme of that project was the idea that the world is worth fighting for. And we should, because it's about the desire to have children and the desire to like reproduce, basically. And there's a really intense streak of nihilism in our world right now because people are confronting a huge existential crisis and real threat of climate change and war and those two things combined. And there's in many people I feel and see this sense of hopelessness. And a lot of times that manifested in my, experience of being a young person who would say to people, I really can't wait to have a kid. I don't want to be a dad. That's part of me being a trans person, is wanting to be a dad. People would say to me, how can you think about bringing in another life into this world? That was often the reaction, was and not in a judgment place, but wow, I can't even imagine wanting to have a kid because everything seems so hopeless.
Right.
And so the project of that book was to say, it's in our human nature to be parents and to have children. And children are inherently worthwhile. And it's the same concept of if you think we shouldn't have kids, then why don't we all just give up right now?
What are we doing? Yeah, right.
What are we doing? What are we doing? And so that was really the point of that book, was to say being a human, even despite the immense tragedy of this moment in time, is so worthwhile, and we have to fight for it to continue. And part of being a human, and fighting and struggling, is one and the same. Having a child, and it's one thing to say, I don't always say things. I wouldn't always say things having a child is an act of resistance. But in some ways it kind of is when you think about it.
It really could be. And I find what you're saying so interesting, because I have often thought that a lot of the fear and phobias for trans and homophobia and transphobia is fear around that instinct to procreate. And somehow people think that homosexuality or being transgender is a threat to that. Right. And so, I don't, and this is just me, when I've thought, is that, when I've just been sort of thinking about what is going on and why. And so to have the way that you're talking about this is so powerful. And so I want to read your book now. And I think that it's so powerful, so positive, and so to me, revolutionary.
What was the idea?
And so I love this, how you're articulating this and what you're talking about here, because I think it's important. I think it's really important, because I think there's, blatant or latent fear, something that is underlying about procreation. But no matter who you are, whether you're homosexual, whether you're trans, that instinct is there because you're human.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a threat. So, I just think it's powerful what you're talking about. That could be a whole other interview, and maybe it needs to be on the book, on your book.
I'll send you a copy. I'd be happy to.
No, that's awesome. But I think it's a great positive way to end this short little interview that we had. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and get to know you a little bit. I'm so happy that you exist, and the work that you're doing, and the writing and the performing, and just showing up. So thank you so much for being on Trans Heartbeat.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
What a joy it was to spend time with Eisa Al-Shamma. I loved this conversation because it reminded me that art isn't separate from our lives. It helps us survive them, whether through clowning, storytelling, organizing, writing, or simply telling the truth out loud. Eisa shows us that joy and resistance can live side by side. And maybe that's the invitation from today's episode, to be a little braver, a little more ourselves, and to keep creating the world we want to live in. Thank you for joining us on Trans Heartbeat. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow, like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us amplify trans voices, stories, and creativity. Until next time, keep showing up and keep creating.